Now, Dave, I know you've written about this on Substack. What's your take?
Yeah, so what I wrote about on Substack was remembering Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook was about 10 years ago. Sandy Hook was the moment when it seemed to me if we don't do anything at all in response to guns here, then there's something just fundamentally broken in the government. Because while there's been 200 mass shootings in 2022, we haven't had 200 days in 2022. But a school shooting registers differently, particularly in elementary school. Because if we as a country aren't going to respond to threats to our children in elementary school, then what will we respond to? And what I talked about in the piece was the NRA's response to Parkland. This is a lecture that I've been giving in my strategic political communication class ever since Parkland happened. Ever since Sandy Hook happened. The NRA's response was kind of narrowly rational if you understand something about strategic comms, which is what we call conflict management or meta frames. The meta frame for gun politics in the United States right now, and for a while now, is you are either pro-Second Amendment or anti-Second Amendment. And so long as that's the dominant frame, the NRA keeps on winning. And not only does it keep winning, but they get to enjoy having Republican state legislators jumping over each other to prove that they are the most pro-Second Amendment. So not only will they defend existing gun laws, but they'll pass new gun laws saying, we want to make sure that people can have their guns in bars when they're drunk, as if that's a good idea. So that meta frame is one by which they keep on winning. And I think there was a recognition from the NRA after Sandy Hook that if they came to the table and said, okay, sure, let's talk about the most basic regulations that even our own members support. And let's pass something sensible that works for everyone and makes the country a little safer, just like a little bit. The recognition is that changes the meta frame so that we start having a conversation about what are the reasonable safety precautions that we can all agree about when it comes to deadly weapons. I went to a protest after Sandy Hook, just outside of the building where Wayne LaPierre gave his speech in response. And my message when reporters came to me of why are you here is I kept telling them, I think we need to regulate deadly weapons as much as we regulate Sudafed. If that becomes the meta frame, then you don't just get background checks. You don't just get the really basic, simple stuff that everyone agrees with, because then you get more shootings. And after each shooting, the question of, well, clearly our safety precautions aren't enough yet. Let's take the next reasonable one, starts clawing through. So they have held firm, and I think they'll keep on holding firm out of the understanding that the only way they can keep on winning is if they keep making America less safe by refusing to let us have the reasonable conversation. In the near term, I think that's going to keep on happening, which means we're going to have more stories, more depression, more bodies. In the long term, this can't last. But I'll tell you, I think like everyone, it's been a very tough week watching all of this, because I don't have any hope that we're going to see anything different this time. What do you think?
No, I agree. And I should tell our listeners that part of us, what we do is hot takes, and then with the footnotes, and the footnotes are links to things that we talk about. I'm putting them up on Medium, on my Medium channel. They're on peterloge.com/podcast. They'll be, we'll tweet them out, including a link to Dave's Substack piece. A couple of things occurred to me before I get into what I wrote on Medium. The first is you point out that the current meta frame is you're either for or against the Second Amendment. Because it's the Constitution, the only answer is for. If, on the other hand, this is framed as public safety or children's safety or public health, which I know the Centers for Disease Control, pediatricians and others have been arguing for a while, then the debate becomes, how do we keep our children as safe as possible, right? So in that context, a lot of Democrats say, I'm pro-Second Amendment, but I support background checks, I support blah, 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 blah. It sounds like that's a mistake, because what they're doing is reinforcing the fact that the debate is about the Second Amendment. What they should be saying is, I am about protecting children from weapons of war. And just ignore the words Second Amendment. Is that about right?
I think that's right. I think you definitely don't lead with I'm pro Second Amendment, but I think it's okay down the, like, if you're like in an actual debate, or if you're talking with a reporter and it gets deep enough, like an on-air interview, I think it is reasonable to note, look, the Second Amendment calls for well-regulated militias. I'm in favor of the Second Amendment, including figuring out what regulations are going to make them operate well. So there's an argument back, there's a back and forth argument about what does the Second Amendment say. There's plenty of scholarship showing that the current interpretation of it is very new and has nothing to do with what the founders or previous generations believed. But you don't want to lead with that, because again, that leans into this pro or con Second Amendment, which is the worst possible frame, given, again, every other constitutional amendment, including the First Amendment, has limits. The Second Amendment isn't the magical amendment with no limits. But since the real goal is to change the meta frame to one of what are the responsible limits and regulations that we put on deadly weapons, you want to keep people focused on that. That also does mean, I think, and this is looking ahead to, there are negotiations going on amongst Republican and Democratic senators right now. I'm skeptical that this time will be any different. I think this is loosening the football. But what I would say is, if something incredibly weak comes out from them, take it and call it a win. And the reason here is that this issue area, as opposed to, say, climate, like climate is the one that I know best. When it's climate, you need big and bold all at once, because you're only going to get one shot, and then it'll be a long time before you get another shot. When it's guns, since we are unfortunately, like, statistically guaranteed that there will be more insane mass tragedy. And one of the shootings, I think it was the one in Oklahoma, was with an automatic, it was with an assault rifle that was bought like less than 3 hours before the shooting. Past the super easy stuff now, get that win, start making this a conversation about what are the appropriate regulations. And then, since there's going to be another tragedy, that's when you call for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So it's not that it's not that all advocates should always like take the deal, but this is a spot where you take the deal, because until we get this under control, and it's going to take a long time, there's going to keep being mass tragedies, which means there's going to keep being opportunities for addressing it further in a way there aren't in other issue areas.
See, I think that's largely right, except I am going to disagree on mentioning the Second Amendment at all. Mm-hmm. And as much as I really dislike George Lakoff, it's hard to ignore his book, Don't Think of an Elephant. Mm-hmm. So the moment you say Second Amendment, all you think, oh, now we don't want to talk about the Second Amendment. Then all I hear in the back of my head is Second Amendment, Second Amendment. It's like a magician who says nothing up my sleeve. You can't not look at the guy's sleeve. Sure. I did this when I worked on the death penalty. People would say, aren't you really anti-death penalty? And the answer was, that's the wrong question. Mm-hmm. You know, so what we need to do is we need to regulate weapons of war and make sure children are not exposed to weapons of war. Mm-hmm. Make sure that people who have a history of domestic violence don't get to buy weapons of war. You don't get to be a soldier in your own house. Mm-hmm. The question then becomes, well, what about the Second Amendment? That's the wrong question. The right question is, how do we best protect? I would simply constantly steer away from it. And it sounds irritating and frustrating in the context of an interview, mm-hmm. but very few people listen to every word of every interview. They don't listen the way one does on a conversation. Our listeners right now aren't even listening to us, but instead just
listening to me, they're not listening to you.
We're just talking, I'm getting a snack. But it's the just bang on the message and bang on the message.
So I'm partially with you. And I think that the thing I want to note here is it depends a bit contextually on which media you're engaging in. And the reason for that is that message discipline you're talking about, which, you know, I was raised in and trained in as well, I think works less well in the current media environment. Like, I agree with you. The general rule is to say, look, that's the wrong question, and pivot back to your message. But if that ends up coming across as this person is terrified to engage, so they're sticking to their message discipline, then that ends up kind of becoming the story of like this person who can't answer it. And so, like, I think the ability, like with the current media we have, I think there's a real value to performing authenticity. And what you want to avoid, like, yes, don't accept their frame. Yes, of course. But aim towards authenticity. And that means that the fifth time that you say, no, 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 I'm not going to use those words, I'm going to switch to another thing. If that ends up looking really politician-y and inauthentic, steer away from that, even if that means that you actually use their word once in a line that also has a really good kicker in it.
I think if that's the case, then I think there are a couple of ways around it. One is, again, I would never say Second Amendment, but I say things like, of course, nobody wants to ban guns. Nobody wants to confiscate all the guns. That's just not realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Or something like, the founders never intended for us to kill our children.
Yeah.
Right. The founders never envisioned a world in which guns were the leading cause of source of suicide, method of suicide in this country. That's not what the founders had in mind. So let's talk about how we can keep children safe, how we can decrease, make suicide, right? A lot of people who attempt suicide regret it immediately after the attempt, but guns are more successful than other kinds of attempts. Like the founders didn't have this in mind. So let's talk about ways to get weapons of war off the streets and out of our schools. Let's make our schools safe for children, not for guns.
I'm good with all that. I just would also add in, like I would come up with some punchlines that allow you to counterpunch when you need to.
I'll buy that. I'll buy that.
Like I'm okay with using the word Second Amendment if you've got a good punchline so that they can't grab those two sentences and use them, because those sentences also deliver your message and hit back real hard.
Does it make sense to then say, under the NRA's logic, we should air child porn on television because it's the First Amendment?
In like a debate maybe, but otherwise I don't like under the NRA's logic as a line. I mean, we don't have a candidate or group that we're workshopping for right now, but I think pointing out every time they lean on the Second Amendment, they're doing that because they're scared to have the bigger conversation about all the deaths that they're profiting from.
There we go.
Like that's where you want to be. And okay, using the word Second Amendment so long as it's delivering that message.
I think we said Second Amendment is a crutch. I think it's a good message. All right, so the clock is running, so I want to keep the debate moving in different directions, but also on guns. A couple of things to note. First, again, this is going to be on Medium, on peterlodge.com podcast. We'll tweet it out. There is a mass shooting database. It gets updated daily, which is a terrifying thing to read. I encourage everybody to visit it because it's important to be terrified by all of this. A lot has been written about the gun debate recently. There's an interesting piece in the New York Times recently suggesting PSAs to get people to buy fewer guns. I think it probably can't hurt, but it probably won't help, because I think the op-ed misses some key points. But it's a question of how do we sort of engage a public conversation to get people to stop being so gun reliant. A couple of other pieces that have come out recently are questioning how can the polls indicate gun control is so popular yet continues to fail so spectacularly. And that gets tied to an argument that I've made a lot, both online and I think on this program, that public opinion matters a lot less than elections, right? So it's gun policy is public policy. You want to change public policy, you've got to change policymakers. So ultimately what the American people want broadly or conceptually in a poll matters less than what they are willing to vote on and vote for. And until elected officials are punished at the polls for opposing gun control, they will oppose gun control. And a recent example of that is Chris Jacobs, Republican congressman of New York, who right after the Buffalo shooting came out for reasonable gun control and was chased out of the Republican primary. And he is not running for re-election for the US House because he had the temerity to say some reasonable gun control in the wake of a mass shooting in my congressional district makes sense. So you can talk about 80% supporting whatever, or 70% or whatever, doesn't matter, as long as elected officials believe that supporting any kind of gun control will cost them their job. Public opinion doesn't matter, right? Elected officials' behavior incentives. You have to create an incentive, like the rest of us do. I like my job. I do things to keep my job, even if I think some of those things are silly, because I like my job. No congressmen also like their jobs, and they're not going to behave in ways that they think put their jobs at risk, right? So until it becomes clear that opposing gun control costs you your election, it's going to be really hard to get any kind of gun control. which leads then to the last piece that I want your take on. And that is the story of an election matters more than the election. And again, you and I have talked about this in the past in other contexts. So I think gun control advocates have to tell a compelling story that candidate A lost because they opposed gun control, or the election was closer than it otherwise should have been because they opposed gun control. Sure, they won, but their opposition to gun control really whittled away at their base, really made it dicey. Because elections are decided for a lot of reasons. So strength of the candidate, the economy, legislative districts, like a bazillion reasons. But we all want the compelling story. Oh, that was the thing. That was the thing. Right. And coming out of the 2000 election, the NRA said Gore lost because of his position on gun control.
Well,
Gore
not
lost.
2000, it was, I think, in the 90s as well, 94, 96. There's no evidence that the NRA really swung many races, but there's great evidence that they told a convincing story that they did.
Well, and more importantly, not only in the 90s, but in 2000s, the Democrats began repeating that. Right. And they then bought Wayne LaPierre. Again, there's some links that are going to be on Medium and peterloge.com/podcast. No, they're in my Medium piece, or my Medium piece. So I talk about this. And I was up there, right? I mean, I was a chief of staff during Columbine.
Yeah.
And I was, I've been working in politics most of my life. And, we all bought oh no, you got to run away from guns. You got to run away from guns. It's because the NRA told a story that Democrats believed. That doesn't make the story true.
Right. Now, what this points out to me is, I think the theme here is electorally, you got to pick a fight and win. Because that's how everyone's going to try after the fact to message in elections that it looks good for them. You have to pick a fight and win it such that people really believe you when you do that messaging that everyone else is doing. So I think you're right about that. This also, and again, when Sandy Hook happened, I didn't have kids, and it wrecked me as a citizen that this was happening to an elementary school and we would do nothing. And Uvalde's happening, and it's hitting differently because my kid goes to elementary school across the street. It could be here just as easily as anywhere else. But the thing I want to point out is it's also about more than guns, because this is the loudest canary in the coal mine of just how wrecked our politics is. Because is there any question that if they pass not the weak stuff, but or anything really bold, is there any question that this Supreme Court wouldn't strike it down? And we are so far down the path to being ungovernable that not only can we not protect our elementary schools, but there's also this depression that sets in of, well, they're not going to do anything. And if they did also, it would just get overturned. Now, you're right that the positive way through that is pick a fight and win. You win elections, you tell a different story, and the NRA's narrative power goes away, and that's most of its power. So yes, do that. And also on a grander scale, the fact that this is the terrain we're fighting on says something about how late it is in the clock for this being a functional democratic system.
Yeah, I think you've hit on some really important things here. The first is, of course, that it's the level of complexity and the level of brokenness in the system where we're even having this conversation. To put this in a bit of context, I'm older than you. I am old. I'll just own that.
I'm old, so you're super old.
Yeah. I'm older. In high school, I had a ban handguns button on my knapsack. I went to a pretty violent high school in a town that at the time was pretty violent.
Also, you had a knapsack? Let's revisit that, because that hasn't been net. You mean a backpack?
Yeah, like a backpack, like the thing with the straps and the books.
Okay. So this is too serious of a topic for us to spend 10 minutes on how you think a backpack is called a knapsack. So later episodes, we're going to talk about that. Man, you sound like grandpa is all. Anyway, continue.
I am very confused. I'm very confused. At any rate,
it says knapsack. Anyway, back to your point, please.
I don't know. I feel a little hurt. In college, I volunteered to Fund Bank for Handgun Control Incorporated. I was a chief of staff in the House, as I said, during Columbine. I happened to be at the White House the night after the Parkland or the Sandy Hook shootings. I saw the president and first lady, who were obviously also pretty wrecked because their kids were elementary school kids. I'm like, I've seen this debate before. I was on some talking head show after, I think it was after Parkland, and the host was saying, finally, we're going to get gun control. Finally, we're going to get gun control. My answer was, of course not, because nothing has changed. None of the fundamental underlying dynamics have changed. I was at the first conference of Americans for Gun Safety, which is a pro-gun gun control group that supported things like McCain-Feinstein gun control legislation that has gone nowhere. And you and I both have friends whose kids were in school at Burke Elementary here in Washington, D.C., when bullets came screaming around the school. And they weren't shooting at kids, but it was next to a school. And, all of our friends then relived that last week. This is, are you kidding me awful? And are you kidding me broken? A guy named Isaac Saul wrote a piece called We Are Broken that ran a Persuasion and was initially in the Tangle, that he looks at the complexity of this, and that we've really got, this isn't just about guns, and we have to approach the debate in a much more nuanced way than we have been so far, and we will continue to, but the clock is running, Dave. So let's get to, you think the rest of, there's a bit of good news.
One more depressing thing first, which is I just have to say that a country that can't be bothered to try to protect its children doesn't deserve to be a country anymore.
It's fairly appalling and pretty offensive.
What are we going to do?
And
but now let's go late. Now
no, as you said, it's the NRA's power is fear. There's a terrific piece in the New Yorker a couple of years ago that looked at the NRA lobbyists in Florida. And basically what she did was terrify legislators. And again, I'll throw that link up as well. There's a bit of good news, then we're going to get to a whole series of other bits of bad news. Because bad news isn't just limited to guns. The good news is the White House is finally paying its interns. This is important because the way you build a career in Washington is by starting at the very bottom of the food chain, which usually means an intern, getting coffee, and then working your way up. If internships are unpaid, the only people who can afford to intern and start a career in politics are those who can afford to live for free in a very expensive city. That's a very small slice of America that doesn't look like a whole lot of America. So the fact that the White House is paying its interns means a whole new group of people can now afford to participate in the national conversation in meaningful ways, help drive legislative agendas, and be part of the conversation. Huge kudos to President Biden for finally doing this. That's the good news. I've got other bad news. What other bad news do you have? Tell me about Elon Musk and his ongoing effort to not buy Twitter.
I have some good news. Elon Musk, we're recording this on Monday, June 6th. Elon Musk sent a letter today saying, you know what? I don't think I want to buy Twitter. Now, this is probably him trying to get a lower price, even though he already signed a deal at the existing price. His claims for why he doesn't want to buy Twitter are that there are bots, and he didn't know there were bots, even though when he said he was going to buy Twitter, he said, it's because I want to get rid of all the bots. I know how many bots there are. And when he was offered the chance to do due diligence, he was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And now he's like, but I didn't know about all these things. Elon Musk continues to be the world's dumbest rich man. But the good news here is it's looking less likely that he will buy and destroy Twitter. And more likely than the process, he will have torpedoed a reputation that needed to be torpedoed. Yay, let's make fun of the rich guy.
So, and that's also a prediction you made early on in season 1, was that Elon Musk was not going to buy Twitter. And for a hot second, it looked like you were wrong, but it turns out you're just playing the long game. You're just playing the
long game of things will always get stupider, and him actually buying Twitter, while stupid, can still be undermined by a stupider thing.
Had we put more thought into it, we could have called the podcast "Politics Will Always Get Stupider" with Karpf and Loach.
Maybe for season 3 we'll rebrand.
Other season 3. Hey, sponsors, if you're listening, we can be bought. Other ongoing news from the podcast: Florida Governor DeSantis, fresh off the heels of winning a fight with a pretend mouse, and thereby raising taxes on Florida homeowners. Good job beating the cartoon to hurt your own constituents. Now put kids' health at risk by successfully picking a fight with the Special Olympics. I don't know.
I just want to point out that he is doing this because he believes, possibly correctly, that this is the way to advance the Republican Party. Only the Republican Party can fix the Republican Party, and American government doesn't work if one of our parties has decided it doesn't like democracy and it would prefer authoritarianism. on the one hand, like it's funny because like, what are you doing, man? And on another level, it's just another data point of this is a country whose elites are acting like we don't deserve to be a country anymore. Like we deserve better than this, but this is what we have.
Speaking of which, this podcast drops on Tuesday, June the 7th, when 7 states are holding primaries. Everybody has already pre-written the "I told you so, I was right all along" release and tweet. And it's going to be, is this a mandate on Trump or not? And how much of a mandate on Trump was it? So look for results of those. And also this week on Thursday at 8 p.m., the January 6th Commission is holding its first public hearings, which is also going to be a measure of how committed our elites are to maintaining democracy. To maintain democracy at a very basic level is a conversation about what we should do next. Yeah. If we ever come to a conclusion about what we should do next, we cease to be democracy because we will be done deliberating. So at some level, you have to have an ethical obligation to that deliberation itself. Mm-hmm. And this is going to be a test of Republican elites' commitment to democratic dialogue and democratic debate. And I have pretty low hopes, to be honest, but check out the hearings starting this week.
Yeah, I imagine we're going to talk about these hearings over the course of the semester or the course of this season, our summer school edition. I think the thing to wonder about now, there's a world that we might live in where these hearings become the center of the national conversation, where we take seriously as a nation that there was an attack on the Capitol by the outgoing president's supporters. It was organized in a pretty sophisticated manner by his elite supporters and himself. And there's every point of evidence that they will try to do this again in the future. How do we respond? What do we do next? There's a world in which that becomes the center of the national conversation. And there's a world in which it is treated as a sidebar that Democrats on Twitter yell about and ask why no one's paying attention, but it still remains that sidebar. I am worried that we live in that latter world. Do you think we live in the former, or do you think we live in the latter?
No, I think we live in the latter. I think the news story this summer will be, why isn't it bigger news that the outgoing president of the United States was at the very least complicit in an attempt to overthrow the United States government? Why members of Congress may have been complicit in it? Why major figures on television, on print, have a platform that are fundamentally undemocratic? Why aren't we paying attention? Why aren't we taking it seriously? Then normally, as a political guy, I would say, I'm not a big fan of pushing string. If nobody cares, don't do it. But this matters so much that we should do it whether or not anybody cares, because this matters. Yeah. Right. I mean, how we govern ourselves, how we talk about it, whether or not the guy who loses an election says at some point, you know what, I lost the election, and goes home, matters. And so we have to push on it.
Yeah. Whether or not we have violent coups matters.
Yeah.
Well, the way I would end it is to say, so we both agree the story is probably going to be about why isn't this a bigger story? I think the reason why people should be tuning in for the rest of the season is in season 1, there were a few things that you and I were wrong about, and then we tried to learn from them. Hopefully you and I turn out to be wrong about this. But I think over the course of the summer, we're going to be looking at this and figuring out, were we right to be worried how this will be treated? Are there glimmers of hope, or are there lessons to be taken from the failures?
I think that's absolutely right. And a lot will play out during the primary season. How compelling a story are people telling that the reason such and so won or lost a primary is because they're too closely or not closely enough aligned with Donald Trump, and an attempt to undermine or overthrow democracy. On the way out the door, I know you've got strong feelings about the metaverse, and I wanted to make sure you saw the news that Paris Hilton wants to be queen of the metaverse. Final thought on that, Dave?
My final thought, we didn't mention, Sheryl Sandberg also announced that she's stepping down from what was Facebook, is now Meta. I put these two data points together to tell you, man, a year ago, I wrote a piece for Wired Online saying that they just basically that the metaverse and VR and AR are fetch, and companies have got to stop trying to make fetch happen. It's a year later, and I got to tell you, Paris Hilton wants to be queen of the metaverse. I was so right about that. Meta as a company is in so much trouble because they are banking on their future on a thing that is silly and no one actually wants.
With that, thank you everybody for tuning in to the first episode of the second season of Office Hours with Karpf and Loach. You've got our hot takes, our footnotes as always. We're on peterloach.com/podcast and on my Medium page. And Dave, you've also got a Substack and a Twitter feed you want to plug?
Yeah, I'm Dave Karpf, DaveKarpf on Twitter, and it's davekarpf.substack.com. Tune in to those outlets if you want to hear more about how I think American democracy really doesn't work, but also things like the metaverse work even less.
And I'm at PLOGE on Twitter. You can also pick up soccer gossip and the absolute comms train wreck, which is UEFA, the French government, and pretty much anybody trying to explain the Champions League final. Follow us, rate us.
Richmond.
The one thing you know about soccer. The rate us, follow us, tell your friends, and tune in 2 weeks. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.